Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those within the community, as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Welcome to Insights. I'm Kent Davis. Just over a year ago, the term critical race theory really entered mainstream American political discussion. But what is it? To answer that question, we spoke to some scholars who study the field. So today, you'll learn from them the origins of critical race theory, its applications, and how it connects to the changes in American history that are happening in local schools. So without further ado, here's our first guest. We are speaking with Dr. Onwubiko Agozino of Virginia Tech. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Critical race theory emerged from critical legal theory in the 1970s. So let's start with that basis. What is CLT and how does CRT spin off of that?
Thank you for the question. Historically, the teaching of law in law schools was approached as a science that tries to guarantee formal equality before the law and objective judgment by judges and juries. Just before World War II, scholars at the Frankfurt Institute in Germany started questioning the assumption of objectivism and formalism by raising the issue of class inequality that makes people unequal even before they come before the law. So that was how it started, as a critique of formal equality when substantive inequality still exists. And they were trying to correct that by deepening or trying to deepen democracy by making sure that the law or justice was accessible to all, including poor people. That came over to the US as a movement. It's called the Critical Legal Studies Movement, to say that formalism and objectivism are not guaranteed because the law remains flawed and the need of a deeper democracy that would ensure that poor people and rich people got equal chances, thereby ending poverty, doing policies that would get rid of poverty and guarantee substantive equality. The civil rights movement in the 60s, the women's movement in the 70s came quickly to remind critical legal theory that it is not only class inequality that makes people unequal before they come before the law, that racial inequality and gender inequality are also operating alongside class inequality to make some people unequal even before they come to the law. Racism from sexism and from poverty, because in actual fact, people do not experience them differently. They are joined together. It is called intersectionality. They're not separate. They're different things, but they're not separate things. They work together all the time. And so that is why we see critical legal theory as a very good contribution towards deepening democracy around the world, and including the US. It is a topic that comes up in class, especially in classes like criminology or law or sociology of law, which I teach, or the civil rights movement, a class that I also teach. So it's a very important contribution to knowledge.
I see. So it's like looking at the system of law and recognizing that it's not something objective and applicable in all circumstances because it's made by people.
Yes, more than that, but also because it is a part of a social structure that is put in place to work in the interests of some people, but not always in the interests of others. So even if your intentions are good and you are a police officer, you got to admit that there is still a lot of institutionalized racism in the way the police works, in the way the criminal justice system works. It doesn't mean that you personally is racist, but that there is still a lot to be done to ensure that the law is operated in such a way to benefit everybody. It's in the interest of all of us, no matter your racial background, no matter your gender, no matter your class, to come together and try to deepen democracy in America. It will be in the interest of all.
And what are some areas that CRT scholars look at? What are some issues they examine?
The first thing is what they call the interest convergence. A lot of people will look at the struggle against racism as a special interest. CRT says it's not a special interest because we have a common interest in a more democratic society, in a more just society. But some politicians think that criticizing racism means you're against white people. That's not true. A lot of white people are also against racism. Criticizing sexism doesn't mean you're against men. And the same thing goes with poverty. It's not only poor people who are concerned about poverty. Lots of rich people are also concerned. So it's not a divisive issue. It is an issue that brings us all together in coalitions and in alliances.
And where are some points where CRT scholars tend to differ?
Yes, that's a good question. The way CRT is seen in America is called intersectionalism or intersectionality, whereas the way I study CRT in the UK, it is called articulation. The problem with intersectionality is that it is using models that are difficult to adapt. For example, if you come at the road intersection, so you're coming from one road called race, another person is coming from another road called gender, and another is coming from another road called class, and they intersect. According to articulation, there is no road that is called race that is not already also articulated with class and gender at the same time, because if you're looking at poor Black women, for example, they do not experience racism in one courtroom and then go to another courtroom to experience poverty and then go to another courtroom to experience sexism. All are taken into consideration in how people relate to them.
Why do you think CRT has suddenly entered the cultural conversation?
I think it's a misunderstanding. A lot of people who are opposed to CRT think CRT is only about racism. They do not understand that CRT is against racism, sexism, imperialism, or poverty. So if they are reminded that the United States of America is a revolutionary country that emerged opposing imperialism, so in that sense, America already came formed at birth in articulation, because the struggle for independence was joined together, not separate from the struggle against racism and the struggle against sexism. Because, you know, it took another 200 years or so before women could get the vote and before slavery could be ended. So all those struggles went on together for quite a long time. Therefore, our governor here in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, has set up a tip line to report teachers who are teaching CRT. And I intend to send him a tip to say CRT is good for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for asking me.
Insights will return after these messages.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Rodney Coates, a professor of critical race and ethnic studies at Miami University in Ohio. Dr. Coates, thank you for joining us on this show.
Thank you for welcoming me, sir. I'm honored and humbled just to be here.
We're talking about how some public school teachers are changing the way they approach race in the classroom. The most notable example is curriculum based on the 1619 Project by the New York Times. Their core concept is the placement of slavery front and center in American history. How does this compare with the dominant narrative of the USA's past?
First of all, let's understand that you've got two competing versions of history. The one is called the 1776 Project, and the other is the 1619 Project. What's the difference between these two is one features the exploits of particularly white males. Okay, the other features the realities of existence by a multitude of characters. All right, I want you to think of the difference between, I'm not sure if your listeners or viewers saw or remember, Our Gang versus Sesame Street. Okay, well, Our Gang is in black and white, appeared in the 1940s, 1950s, and had one black character. Okay, Sesame Street is in live and in color, and it has a multitude of identities, so forth and so on. Okay, that's the difference. All right, put a different way, imagine that you have 15 people that view a incident and you only talk to one. Okay, that means you only see one viewpoint. Well, depending upon where you're standing, you can get 14 other viewpoints based upon that.
I see. And if I recall correctly, Sesame Street faced similar backlash for its integrated cast.
It sure did. All right, because it was so radically different from what some wanted to even consider. Okay, the fact that we have a range of individuals that constitute our identities. Okay, it's much like, and if you want to understand why there is some problems with it, there's an old African phrase that says something to the extent of that the hunt will cease to be glorified when lions become historians. Okay, so we're in a period of time where the lions are becoming historians. Okay, where blacks and women and Asians and Native Americans, okay, are becoming historians. Let me give you one more example. Okay, 1492, Columbus sailed the blue and discovered America. Okay, in 1492, Columbus was discovered hopelessly lost by a group of Arawakan Indians. Okay, all right. By the way, both stories are accurate. Both stories are true. Okay, but they both approach 1492 from two different vantage points. Okay, from the purposes of a student, understanding these two vantage points help them to situate themselves in that history.
So it's like a broader perspective.
Multiple perspectives, yes, sir.
Why and how do perspectives of history change over time in academia?
They've changed as we've indicated. You got more voices, more people than history started in this country by the telling of and by white historians. Okay, and that's a relatively conservative viewpoint of history. And from the vantage point of people of color and women, their history starts as slaves. Okay, all right. Women's history starts with the 19th Amendment, for example, okay, in 1919, all right. Excuse me, women had voices in 1492. And in 1776, all right, we just don't make reference to those voices, all right. Slaves, Africans were more than slaves in 1776, not only in this country but also a whole continent of Africa, all right. And we have all of these other histories that we are now discovering, all right, that are broadening, using your term, our understanding of what this thing called America is.
Why do you think it's important to talk about that history of race in the U.S.?
You should know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Okay. All right. We must understand that scripture there. We must understand the truth of who we are, how we got here, if we're going to proceed. Or we're going to wind up circling this wagon over and over again around the same tree. Okay, it's interesting that Desmond Tutu in South Africa, as they were coming to grips with apartheid, orchestrated what they call a truth and reconciliation, okay, sessions, all right? That we must know the truth if we're going to reconcile our histories.
Some critics of these changes in history allege that it's meant to teach white kids that they're bad or kids that the United States is evil. And where do you think that perspective comes from?
It comes from, one, a misreading of the material that is being presented. Okay, let's be honest. One, we have a whole cottage industry of what I call diversity and equity pimps. Okay, and they're out here pimping this whole notion of diversity and inclusion. All right, I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar affair, and part of that is talking about white guilt. Okay, and the notion that all whites are guilty by virtue of something that happened 100 years ago. All right, I am not responsible for what my parents or their parents did. Okay, all right, and I cannot be held accountable for the choices they made or not. Okay, because I wasn't in on those choices. Anyone that suggests that whites are guilty by virtue of being whites or that blacks are victims by virtue of being black are racist. And those are racist terms. Okay, all right. That's like saying current day Germans are responsible for the Nazi Holocaust. No, they're not. Okay, all right, but they must understand how their forebearers, parents, created a Nazi Germany, okay? And it was created, by the way, through ignorance. All right, it's interesting that the first thing that Hitler did was to begin burning books. It's interesting that the first laws to control Africans and women and so forth was to control education, okay? And the current backlash is also about that controlling education. Okay, by the way, the basis of it's interesting. The very first thing that Africans did after the end of slavery was to set up schools. Okay, it's interesting that most of our battles in this country have centered around educational institutions. Why is that the case? Because free your mind and the rest will follow. Okay, all right, and this is about liberating our minds, and that's why it's a contentious battleground.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Coates.
All right, you too.
Have a good one.
Be blessed.
Insights will return after these messages.
Welcome back to Insights. We're here with Dr. Wendy Moore of Texas A&M University. She's a professor of sociology and scholar of critical race theory. Dr. Moore, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you wanted to share with us a story about education and race, correct?
Yes, thank you. I would like to give a little bit of background. So as a critical race theorist, I focus on the theory, which comes out of elite law schools, and really the works of faculty and students of color in those law schools who were admitted after being excluded prior to the 1964. They're admitted into these law schools, and one of the projects that they engaged in was identifying sort of the normative white assumptions that are embedded in our culture. And so the example that I want to share with you today is actually, I think, one that really is illustrative of why it's very important to center the histories and experiences of people of color and have this be a sort of central tenet of what critical race theory does. The example that I want to share actually has to do with the recent conversations about critical race theory and the debates about whether or not we should be teaching about critical race theory. So a news outlet sent out a tweet of a story about whether or not we should be teaching about race and racism. And the headline of their tweet was, "How young is too young to teach about race?" That's a quote. And the response to that from Black, Indigenous, Asian American, Latinx folks was amazing. There were over 6,000 tweets. I looked at about 1,000 of them that responded that kind of called attention to the fact that in this question, how young is too young to teach about race, the universal child that they're thinking about teaching to was a white child, because kids of color already learn about race. And so some of the tweets, if I could just read a couple for you. So for example, one person said, "I learned racism when I was 8 years old on the school playground. when our team won in kickball and a white boy on the losing team got angry and called me the N-word. Another person says, my kindergarten teacher on my first day of school punished me for saying bless you in Spanish when she sneezed, slapping my hands 3 times with a ruler and saying, now that you're in America, you'll speak English. Another person said, well, I was called an epithet for Japanese Americans in elementary school, so we should think about that. And another person said, and I thought this one was particularly interesting, when I was 6, a younger white child not only called me, quote, brownie, but once I asked, even explained that she got in trouble for using the N-word. And so she started using brownie instead. Not only the cognitive capacity for racism, but even the ingenuity to circumvent punishment. So I think that these provide some examples for how important it can be to center the experiences and histories and knowledges of people of color. And that when you do that, it kind of sheds light on the way in which we normalize race sort of tacitly as white, right? So the news outlet wasn't attempting to be biased when they put that headline forward, and probably weren't thinking about the fact that they were imagining a white child. But when we look at these experiences of people of color, we see it exposes this normalization of white.
So in a sense, a lot of our culture tends to treat white as the default and other ethnicities and groups as variants of that.
Absolutely. So the universal child in sort of the national imagination, right, is a white child. And again, I want to emphasize that this is tacit. So this is something that, I think a lot of people aren't really thinking about the fact or aren't trying to be racially biased, right? When they do this, it's just a normal part of US culture. And a lot of that has to do with this exclusion from our institutions where we create knowledge, right? Higher education, law schools, for most of the history of the perspectives of people of color. So it's a reason that centering that perspective becomes so important.
Now, when we see bills targeting CRT in public schools, we see that it's not actual CRT being targeted. What gets caught in the crosshairs in its place?
So that's a really interesting and connected question, because I've looked at the laws in various states, and there's some differences, right, among the statutory language. But for the most part, all of them include some form of restriction on teaching anything to students that will make them feel guilty because of their race, right? And again, we see the normalization, right, of white children. So really what these legislation are targeting is making sure that white kids in schools don't feel guilty, right? Because we don't imagine that kids of color are going to feel guilty. And so the statutes are not only sort of targeted at white kids in a way that really is in the imagination of the statute constructors, because what we see over and over again is that kids are saying, I don't feel guilty when I learn about Jim Crow, when I learn about slavery, when I learn about the Holocaust. I feel interested and I want to engage in that, right? And I want to know about it so we don't repeat it. So that is one sort of element. And then the other thing is that it's just like I said, we are not, because we are so afraid of teaching about race and racism, and because we're centering this imagined white child who's going to feel guilty and going to feel bad if we teach about race and racism, we end up poorly educating our children about history. And I think that negatively affects civic education, right? Civics.
That is a very interesting perspective, and I would like to thank you so much for coming on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Dr. Wendy Moore.
Thank you.
If there's a big takeaway from today, I think that it's this. Law is not some perfect body of impartial, objective perfection. Instead, it's a series of rules that we made up Similarly to how there's no objective reason for this penny to be worth 1 cent. That's just the value we assigned. In understanding the different perspectives that people have on the law and the way that their social situations affect how they interact with the law, we can probably try to make the law a bit more equitable.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. If you have any comments, suggestions, or story ideas, please email news@wbkb11.com. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.